be the first self-portrait by a woman artist in the North. Katerina van Hemisen, important painter of the time. Her father trained her. Lavina Tierling, a woman artist who became very prominent, miniature painter, painting on tiny oval medallions and so forth. So she was a miniaturist, painted very, very small paintings. She worked for the court of Henry VIII and was actually more highly paid than Hans Holbein the Younger. So unfortunately, most of her paintings were destroyed in a fire. But Lavinia Tierlink, a very important woman artist of the time, in her portrait of Elizabeth I in her early 20s, we see the headdress like her mother, Anne Boleyn, wore. Joachim Patiner painted this rocky landscape with Saint Jerome. Patiner seems to have understood a bit about color in terms of the use of complementary colors. The distant, cool, cloudy landscape pushes that into the distance with its cool colors, whereas the foreground is warmer, so he understands the plastic quality. Important painter Peter Bruegel. Bruegel looked back a bit at Hieronymus Bosch, if you recall his paintings with a cosmological view with many, many figures. Peter Bruegel also gives us this cosmological view, bird's eye view. Uh, Bruegel traveled extensively in Italy, all the way to Sicily, but seems to not have absorbed or not chosen purposefully not to use Italian influence at all. The only thing is the mountains, the Swiss Alps that you see in the upper right, which are a fantasy cooked up from his drawings. But we see 1565 was a particularly bad winter, and this is part of a cycle of paintings representing the four seasons. The hunters return with their dogs. Um, the people on the left near a tavern are singeing a pig, singeing the hairs off of a pig before it is boiled. Um, we see many of the people ice skating on the frozen ponds below and the activities of the whole village. The painting forms a kind of a diagonal recession into space. The hunters and their dogs kind of joining up with trees and the lines of the, the the streets and so on in the painting, and forming a kind of an implied diagonal from the lower left to the middle upper right. This diagonal accelerates the eye's movement as do the implied movement of the bird in the air, but then that is slowed down or modulated by the verticality of the trees, which kind of check that energy, as well as the ponds. So expert composition, cosmological point of view, depiction of the activities of. We could look back at for example, the Book of Hours, if you recall, the depiction of the activities of the aristocrats and the peasants in winter. So the part of this cycle. Also, Bruegel painted the 100 Netherlandish proverbs. I'm sorry, proverbs such as in the lower left, man biting a column, symbolic of what is that? Symbolic of hypocrisy. These are literal, proverbs, literal visualizations of proverbs. A man bashing his head against the wall um, is seen as a fruitless ambition. On the roof, a man shoots arrows without hitting anything, which is a proverb about foolish waste of energy. Many of these proverbs throughout. the Escorial in Spain by Juan Bautista de Toledo and Juan de Herrera, mainly Juan de Herrera probably. We look at the facade, built in granite, a little bit north of Spain, by Philip the Philip the First, regent of Spain after the death of his father Charles the First, who was also Holy Roman Emperor Charles the Fifth. Remember that Spain is part of the Netherlands. In I think 1521 they split up the Holy Roman Empire. There's an Austrian regent who retains the title Holy Roman Emperor, and then the Spanish Habsburgs under Philip. But he designs this place meant to be a mortuary for the kings of for the Habsburgs, but it's also a monastery and a church almost as grand as St. Peter's, you see, built in a grid pattern, very austere, out of granite rather than marble or limestone. Very imposing, austere structure. The facade, you'll see, we look at very similar to Il Gesù or Santa Susana that we've looked at in Italy. That is with the emphasis on the verticality and the temple front on the second story, with the colossal architecture, Michelangelo columns rising through 2 stories supporting a massive architrave beam, but a much more sort of an austere interpretation of Italian palazzo architecture of the 16th century. El Greco is from Crete. He speaks Greek. He lives in Venice and works in the workshop of Titian for a while, though he seems to have been very influenced by the Mannerists, particularly in the upper portion of this burial of Count Orgoth. Count Orgoth was a benefactor of this church from 300 years before, who the legend was that St. Stephen and Augustine laid him, appeared and laid him in his grave. We see a dichotomy of styles in the lower left. Among the natural world and the physical world, we see natural portraits, very accurate Renaissance realism there, classical realism, and material light. In the upper portion that is spiritual, however, we have a Mannerist figures. You remember Mannerism, ignoring the rules of classical proportion, and an ethereal, unreal, non-material kind of light as we look into heaven. The connection is made by lines of sight, such as the priest who looks upward, and a couple of the figures in the grouping who look upward, making a connection. So there's the lower portion, Renaissance realism, naturalism. the upper portion, Mannerist proportion, ephemeral, ethereal light, and a great many Mannerist attributes. This is his later work would look like this, these elongated figures with this inscrutable light. You cannot tell where it comes from. And it also is leading the way towards the Baroque in its sort of twisting energy.